So this is my Cirrus SR22 G3. It's a sleek, modern, capable, fast aircraft, and until recently I actually thought that this was the perfect aeroplane. But there's another aircraft that's recently joined Echo Yankee Zulu in the hangar here. It's a little bit more capable, and it's made me start wondering, is that the perfect aeroplane? Now there's absolutely nothing wrong with the SR22. I really love flying it, and I'm very privileged and lucky to be able to do so. And there are some real similarities between this and the other aircraft.
The Cirrus SR22 has a single engine that drives a propeller to produce thrust, exactly the same as the Piper Meridian. The Cirrus SR22 can be operated by a single pilot, again, exactly the same as the Piper Meridian.
But then there are also some big differences between the two aircraft.
The SR22 is a piston-driven avgas-burning aircraft, whereas the Meridian is a turboprop. It has a turbine engine that burns jet A1. The SR22 is not pressurized, but the Piper Meridian is and can fly well up into the flight levels. But to properly test the capabilities of this aircraft, we thought we'd take it for a flight.
What's the plan today, Stephen?
Launch testing today, I think.
Yep.
Go somewhere that's about an hour away so we can just get up to altitude and see what the aeroplane's performance is like.
How high are we going to go today?
We'll go down to 25,000 and probably come back at 24 at this stage.
How long will that take to launch this in? It's about an hour and a half in the Cirrus?
Yeah, it's probably going to be under an hour. Manual. Now this is just a push and release, so push it and release. Our prop is turning, fuel flow is 0, NG is coming up, light off, NG is continuing to rise, ITT is coming up, 800, should now come back and then continue to rise through, above 52%, we've now lost our startup, generator on, alternator on, avionics, auto, ignition off. We can then push our bleed air control back in. We go, pressurization switch is on, autopilot master, standby gyro, electric trim, TAS, and we can have a fan and aircon. And it's our start time.
1212, you got me on the left.
I am here.
Amy?
Hello.
Hello.
On ground, good morning, Meridian India Hotel Yankees, taxiing IFR for launch test and 3 pair of EVI run-ups. And that's taxiing at idle there. And all I'm doing when taxiing is lifting it up and coming back. So we've got a beta light on. All it is we're basically taxiing in a zero thrust position of the blades. And we are still making forward thrust, but less than we were. That way we're not really having to ride the brakes when taxiing.
And explain beta.
It's basically a zero pitch on the blade. It just goes to a flat blade. And then it's in between normal and reverse. So if I go reverse, that's it. Now we're making it the other way. And beta is just 0. Now for our takeoff, we have 3 degrees of right rudder trim, which is just this rocket switch down the bottom. We bring that back to 2 degrees in the climb, and then 0 in cruise. That's the scary thing. I have to do the sum. It's 174 pounds of fuel an hour.
So it's burning that even though we're idle?
We're idle.
Yeah. Have you ever calculated that as a dollar figure?
Not yet. We can do.
Hotel Yankee, traffic system and remains on the circuit, cleared for takeoff.
Cover the traffic, clear for takeoff. India Hotel Yankee on the brakes. Up to about 500 or so.
Downwind, touch and go. Sydney number 1.
And then it's a slow advance. Then that's our takeoff torque set there, but I'm only about 3/4 throttle.
Clear for takeoff, Charlie India.
You see what I mean about the nose? You don't see.
Yeah, you're just looking at blue sky. You don't have much of a horizon in front of you.
And pressurization is climbing. Now that we've done the takeoff, everything's done in terms of the aeroplane. What the aeroplane is sitting at, it will sit at the whole way up to
Melbourne, inland route,
25,000 to 26,000 feet.
So what adjustments are you making on the climb then?
So on the climb, all we're going to do, we will slowly lose our torque a little bit as the air thins out. So what we're doing is just very slowly bumping the throttle up just to keep our torque in its range.
So you're increasing the throttle?
Increasing the throttle.
And so the pressurization in the cabin is sorting itself out now? You're not making any adjustments?
Not making any adjustments. Our cabin altitude is currently at 4,000 feet.
Yeah.
Our pressurization pressure is nearly at 2 psi.
And what sort of altitude could you take this aircraft to?
Service ceiling airplane's 31,000. It will get there, but at that altitude you will have to wear oxygen, supplement to oxygen, because that cabin altitude will be about 12,000 feet.
So the other lever here, this condition lever,
Yep.
what are you using that for?
It's essentially a fuel on-off switch, is the best way of thinking of it. It's not a mixture like we got in our pistons. Our third lever on this side is what we call manual override, or an emergency power lever. But if neither of them work, then the engine has let go and has stopped.
Yep.
And then you're coming back to a glide situation. But that's sort of a unrefined throttle, is probably an easy way of thinking.
Yep.
But you never use it unless it's an emergency, like failure scenario.
Alright, so in our SR22, if you and me are flying, if we've got full tanks, we can probably take one other passenger. Today, did we fill it up before we went?
So we were full fuel on the way out.
Yep.
And with the three of us, we're sort of just on max takeoff weight. It's very comparable to the Cirrus in terms of when you start putting 3 or 4 people on, you're coming back to less than full fuel. Same sort of figures. You normally get the same range, just faster.
Amy, what is it like in the back?
Oh, it's lovely.
Spacious. So the
Spacious.
difference between the Cirrus is obviously you've got a lot more room in the back
Oh,
in comparison.
Put my feet out, stretch out, have a nap.
The configuration in the back with the 4 seats is you've got 2 facing each other as well. So yeah, it's probably, in terms of like cruising, if you're going to take a few people with you, maybe it's a bit more comfortable in the back because for your passengers there's a bit more room to stretch out. But at the end of the day, payload-wise, you'd say they're kind of equivalent. Thank you, Amy.
Oh, good.
Have you had your champagne yet?
No, not yet.
Oh, it's Steve.
Flight.
Now, no aeroplane is cheap in terms of the purchase price or how much it costs to keep it running. But if you start to dig into the costs of the Piper Meridian versus a Cirrus SR22, it's actually a lot closer than you might think. I did some searching around and managed to find some examples of Piper Meridians that were around maybe 15 to 20 years old for the same price as last year's model of the turbo version of the Cirrus SR22 G6. Now the avionics between these two is probably going to be quite different. Your Meridian that's 15 to 20 years old is not going to have the same avionics that a Cirrus from last year is going to have. However, if you could pick up a Piper Meridian for a slightly lower price, then you've got some room in your budget to upgrade the avionics, and there are examples of aircraft that were built in the early 2000s flying around with brand new Garmin avionics in their cockpit. And then all of a sudden you have an aircraft that has the equivalent avionics and cockpit experience of a brand new or 1-year-old Cirrus SR22.
Don't get me wrong, this airline airplane is hugely capable. It's all down to the Garmin 650s and stuff.
Yeah.
It'll still fly an approach and follow an ILS down to the ground. You just want to find an airplane with good engine hours and it's damage-free, happy airplane.
And come on, as a pilot, do you have a preference? Like, they're quite different styles of flying already. We've only been flying for about 15 minutes and it feels a bit different in this aircraft.
Very different. I sort of prefer my lower level stuff and hand flying and all that something. This is a really good way of getting from point to point, but the flying in between can get a little bit boring at times, and that's probably a bad way of looking about it, but you're sitting up here away from everything.
Yeah.
And it's very, very simple, but I prefer my low level.
Yeah.
Having fun, like what we do when we go somewhere local. So
yeah, like little trips to Melbourne and smaller airfields. Do you need a separate rating or endorsement or training to fly a turboprop aircraft as opposed to a piston?
Yeah, so there's a gas turbine endorsement, GTE endorsement, which is for this one, and then for this, because it's a pressurised aeroplane, that's a separate endorsement for pressurisation.
Oh, so there's 2 separate ones. But you could do it in an aircraft like this, for example. You could do it at the same time. Now, even though the SR22 and the Piper Meridian that we're flying are completely different aircraft, there are actually some surprising similarities between the two when it comes to their core statistics.
There are probably 4 figures that are most interesting when comparing these two aircraft. The first one is cruise speed, or cruise TAS, true airspeed. Basically, how fast does the aircraft go through the air when it's in its cruise configuration? Now, of course it varies, but for the SR22 it's roughly around 160 knots. For the Piper Meridian, it's around 270. The second is the ceiling, so how high can you actually get this aircraft? Now, the normally aspirated SR22, like Echo Yankee Zulu, you, that will go up to around 16,000 feet, but the turbo version of the SR22 is rated up to 25,000. But of course you have to be wearing a full oxygen mask in the Cirrus aircraft to do that, because it's not pressurized. The Piper Meridian, however, can fly up to 29,000 feet and is pressurized, so as you've seen in this video, we don't have to wear oxygen whilst we're flying at those flight levels. Now when it comes to the aircraft range, and again it varies depending on the configuration, but both aircraft are actually quite similar, with an advertised range around the 1,000 nautical mile mark. And in a typical configuration when cruising along, the SR22 will burn around 17 gallons of fuel per hour, and the Piper Meridian is more like 41. But it's no good just comparing those numbers side by side, it's when you put it into a real world example that things start to get a bit interesting.
So I was just looking at a typical flight, like what I would normally do, say between Moorabbin and Bankstown, so Melbourne and Sydney here in Australia. It's 390 nautical miles between the two. So it worked out in the Cirrus that's going to take around 2.4 hours. But at those speeds here, that would be 1.4. So it's an hour, an hour less.
About 100 knots faster, a little bit more give or take.
So with your fuel burn at those rates, that means that, and I've got it in gallons only, SR22 would burn 41, but this would burn 61. And that's not as much of a difference as I thought between the two, considering you are getting there an hour faster.
But the other thing to remember is that jet fuel is probably 2/3 the price of avgas.
Oh yeah.
So you're getting somewhere faster, probably burning more, but at a very, very similar cost. That might be a little bit arrogant, but you've got to put a little bit of value on your own time too. You've saved an hour of your own time getting there.
Yeah, you know, you talk about the perfect aeroplane, what's going to be perfect for your mission. I look at a plane like this compared to the SR22 and I think, oh, it can go higher, it can go faster, it's pressurized, I can do all those things. But if we were just flying to Melbourne to go and get coffee at the weekend...
Wrong aeroplane.
If you were, theoretically speaking, going to do a trip around the world, say, and you had the choice of the two aircraft...
I would choose the Cirrus purely for the low level, just it's the challenge of getting around the world.
Yeah.
But this would be an easier, more comfortable way to do it.
Mike, contact centre 130.
One advantage you have of this though is Jet A1.
Which you can get everywhere.
Which you can get everywhere, and especially through Southeast Asia and Indonesia, there's a lot more availability. Avgas still can do it, but you normally need to get it barreled in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I can see Tasmania.
So has this flight across to Tasmania in the Piper Meridian changed my mind about what is the perfect aircraft? Well, first of all, let's acknowledge the fact, which is pretty obvious to say, but there is no such thing as the perfect aircraft. There's just the right aircraft for the mission at hand. But I guess the question for me was more, would I ever think about not flying an SR22, a plane which I'm so familiar with and have really fallen so heavily in love with over the years, for something like a smaller turboprop that I could fly higher and potentially faster?
Morning Tower, good morning. Indio Tankies with you, RMP Zulu runway 32, and we are visual.
Well, it is actually quite a tempting thought, but I would want to make sure that you could upgrade the cockpit to something at least equivalent to what you would get in an SR22. So that would mean upgrading to something like the new Garmin G3000 Prime touchscreen flight deck. But it's not just the upfront purchase costs and the upgrades you might want to make along the way. Of course, maintaining a turboprop compared to a piston engine aircraft can be more expensive. Stephen was actually telling me that for the fuselage itself, so basically everything from the engine firewall backwards, the Piper Meridian maintenance costs compared to the SR22 are actually quite similar. But of course it's the turbine-driven power plant of this aircraft that can end up being the most expensive part of owning it.
Yeah, down, I keep my hand on it until we get 3 greens.
So it's really important you're sure of the types of missions you'll be flying before you consider an aircraft like this.
Green, gear is down. You can sort of feel the airplane now that we're relatively low airspeed. It's starting to get a little bit washy.
Indio Yankee, the wind 19 0 degrees, 4 knots, tailwind 1, clear to land.
Clear to land, India, Hotel Yankee.
500.
Just a trickle of power on. It should sit, hopefully, nicely on the runway. Watch me make a meal of it.
He didn't make a meal of it. He did exactly what he does every time he lands a plane, and he landed it really well. I've flown with him for years. It's still annoying to this day. But I'm curious to know, out of the two aircraft, if money was no object, which one would you pick?